and I believe we have Brent Legg and Ashley Hitt with us today to be able to go over this this material. Brent and Ashley, are you on and able to hear us?
Yes, good morning.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning. Awesome. All right, so I will turn it over to you.
All right, great. Well, it's great to be with you all. There are many familiar faces and names on this call. It's great to see Bernadine and Ann and Brent Christensen and Diane and a lot of familiar people that we've worked with over the years. I'm Brent Legg. I'm the EVP of Government Affairs for Connected Nation. I'm joined by my colleague Ashley Hitt, who is our VP of GIS Services. We're really excited to be able to share with you the continued progress and work that we have achieved in delivering yet another update to the Minnesota broadband map. So Ashley, if you'll switch slides here, and I'll just give a brief overview of our agenda. We're going to talk just a bit about about the project background, the work that we've done in the state for the past 12 years. Talk about our provider outreach and data collection process, specifically how we work on to track grants that are provided via the border-to-border grant program. Ashley will talk a bit about our field validation process when we send our engineers into the field to validate the map. I'm going to speak briefly on some updates related to what's happening in Washington related to the potential for more funding for broadband from the federal government. And then we're going to run through a demonstration of our interactive broadband map. So Ashley, next slide. So we have long enjoyed a relationship with the state of Minnesota. We first began mapping broadband service in Minnesota starting in 2008. And as far as I'm aware, Minnesota has had the longest running, continuously updated broadband mapping program of any state in the entire country. The work started with an appropriation from the Minnesota legislature. It continued on through the State Broadband Initiative program years, which was a grant program funded by NTIA at the federal level, and then continued with state funds after that federal program expired. And so we've been very privileged to have a partnership with the state since 2008, and we hope to continue that for many more years. One of the reasons why we began that partnership with the state was when the legislature was considering how to impact the subject of broadband statewide. They really had a difficulty in assessing the extent to which broadband service was available, especially in the state's rural areas. And so that's when we began working directly with service providers, with Brent Christensen and his organization, and with the other various providers throughout the state to begin collecting information on where their networks were physically able to provide service. And this was important because without working directly with service providers to collect information on where their networks are able to penetrate, we really would not have the level of specificity and granularity that's necessary to run a broadband grant program like the border-to-border program. So it's very important for us to interact with the service provider community, to gather information from them on where their networks are physically located and the extent to which they're able to deliver service from that physical infrastructure. So there's a lot of great information that we can collect and validate our maps using, for instance, speed test information. But nothing is really a replacement for working with the providers directly who know their networks the best and can share where they're located. When we pair that with conducting validation on the ground of that infrastructure and pair that with other information from information on speed tests, for instance, we're able to get a much more complete and accurate picture of what's going on in the state. So essentially we take all of that information from service providers, from our field validation exercises, and we aggregate and analyze that broadband data. The information is used to inform the decision-making process in the border-to-border grant program. And then we go through a process, as I said, to take public feedback, to take feedback from the state, to take feedback from people on this call about areas where the map is in question. And we actually send our engineers out to the field to conduct validation on the ground to confirm whether or not the infrastructure that's been reported to us is actually delivering service. And then, as we said, we collect a lot of feedback from the public and from competing service providers on service areas as well. And so, because Minnesota has really invested in the production of a state broadband map now for 12 years, we have, I would say, Minnesota's broadband map is the most accurate and refined state broadband map of any in the country. And we're excited about what the FCC has in store for the digital opportunity data collection and what this means for broadband mapping nationally. I think many states are going to have to pivot to a validation and challenge process as the FCC implements its digital opportunity data collection. So there will need to be some adjustments in our approach as the FCC begins to collect that data federally and produce a new national broadband map that is granular and accurate on a location-by-location basis. But with that said, the work that we have done up until this point in Minnesota has really probably prepared the state of Minnesota to be better able to challenge that federal map and to provide good information to the FCC, probably more so than any other state in the country because of the good work that's been going on there for more than a decade. Ashley, next slide. So the way the process works is, our primary objective is to create a granular statewide map of broadband service availability. We're focused on residential broadband service here, where it incorporates terrestrial fixed broadband, so DSL, cable, fiber to the premises, and fixed wireless service. We go through a process every time we refresh the data of contacting all of the service providers within the state, gathering data from them. Some of them require non-disclosure agreements to be executed. Some of them do not. Non-disclosure agreements essentially allow them to exchange very proprietary and confidential information with us about where their infrastructure is physically located, so that we can help them create service availability footprints that are derived from that infrastructure information. In some cases, some providers don't need to go through that exercise, and so they're able to we're simply able to give them the parameters that we need to collect for the data, and they're able to provide that directly for us without any sort of need to go through an NDA process. So we really try to meet service providers where they are. Many service providers have or do not have GIS expertise internally, and so we do have to go through a back and forth process where we're working with them to create service availability footprints, and they're telling us whether or not that's accurate or not. The goal is to ultimately measure not only where service is available, but also to measure the maximum download and upload speeds for each area with each respective technology. Fixed wireless service is displayed on the map as propagation models for where signal can hypothetically penetrate, and then of course our engineers on the ground validate that service as warranted based on what is displayed in the propagation model. And then regarding wireline service, we're displaying serviceable roads, serviceable footprints, route drop maps, things like that. And Ashley will showcase what that looks like when she runs through the interactive map demo here shortly. Ashley, next slide. So as we mentioned, the maps that we have produced for DEED have long informed the border-to-border broadband grant program. So this is the snapshot of all of the state border-to-border grant program projects from 2014 to 2017, and then the 2019 project awards. It's a little hard to see what those color-coded flags correspond to on this slide, and most of you all have probably seen this map before. But it's very important, obviously, that we're tracking where those state investments are going and how broadband service is improving in those areas based on those investments. Ashley, next slide. So, as I mentioned, we go through a pretty exhaustive process of validating infrastructure information on the ground to determine whether the service availability footprint that we've displayed on a map is actually accurate. So Ashley's going to talk briefly about that process. She leads that division within our organization. So Ashley, I'll turn the table over to you.
Sure. So in terms of like what Brent was saying, we really want to work back and forth with the providers as much as possible to really reflect the most accurate service area that they currently have service at for residential, identifying the speeds for all those residential service areas. But certainly there are going to be areas where there might be discrepancies. There might be areas where the public might look at the map and they've tried to get service from certain providers and they let us or the state know about that. So we're able to go back to the providers, refine their service area information, and then also group those together and go out in the field and validate that coverage as well. We work very closely with DEED, with Diane and Angie, to help identify areas that might be targeted for field validation work. We do this about 3 times a year, looking at specific areas that need that validation completed, traversing the state, marking what areas we physically drive through compared to those service areas, and then making those refinements. Where are areas that might be currently under construction as opposed to completed? What areas may not have the signal that a propagation for fixed wireless service might currently show on the map, so we know to refine that for the next version of the map. But then also working with technicians and engineers from the individual broadband providers so that we can get a better idea of what their network is like, what things are they working on, what things we might need to change on the map so that it is better represented. And then also working directly with consumers in some cases that have either contacted us or contacted the state directly to say that they have issues with their speeds, and then meeting with them. Perhaps they're taking speed tests that are showing much lower speeds than what they are expecting through their service. We're able to confirm if they perhaps need equipment upgrades, that maybe their equipment isn't even capable of reaching the speeds that they are subscribing to, and then perhaps reviewing some possibilities of either they're going off of wireless routers, they're doing Wi-Fi within their house, and so that's not going to be as reflective of a true connection into the network they're subscribing to. So there are some education components, both with the consumers and then working with them on issues. If they truly don't have broadband service or they're in an underserved area, what are some of the things that they can be doing, reaching out to the state? What are things that providers are doing to expand service? So really taking account of kind of multiple levels. Like Brent said, working directly with the providers. We're also doing field validation independent of that. We're also collecting public feedback. And so being able to put all of those components together to further refine and show what does infrastructure look like in the state of Minnesota, and being able to do that by technology, by speed, and then collect the demand information for where people are still unserved so that that focus can really happen. Brent, I'll turn it back over to you for federal broadband updates.
Thanks, Ashley. We're happy to answer any questions about the validation process at the end of our presentation. So some of you, I'm sure, probably do have some questions. Very briefly, I wanted to give you an overview of some of the biggest things that have been happening at the federal level with regard to broadband. In March, Congress passed what was called the Broadband Data Act. which essentially took the FCC's Digital Opportunity Data Collection Report and Order and codified it into law, and then gave the FCC some very specific direction about how to further refine the FCC's previous Digital Opportunity Data Collection Report and Order. And so, as a result, the FCC has issued a second report and order and a third further notice of proposed rulemaking regarding their DODC program. And actually, comments are due today at midnight Eastern Time with regard to that third further notice of proposed rulemaking. And Connected Nation will be submitting a response to that NPRM. Essentially, the Digital Opportunity Data Collection sets up a new national broadband map and data collection process that will be accurate on a location-by-location basis. There will be an underlying data set called the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric that is created to undergird the new national broadband map. And then service providers are required to report on a location-by-location basis where they're capable of delivering service. It is quite complicated beyond that, and I know that you have a presentation coming up with the FCC actually directly here, I think maybe at your next meeting, where they're going to get into some of these discussions in more detail. So for the interest of time, I won't spend a lot of time on that other than to briefly expand on my comment, the presentation, that states are going to need to pivot as you think about broadband mapping and challenging that new national broadband map. So Congress has not yet appropriated funding for the FCC to fully implement the digital opportunity data collection. There have been a lot of rumors that Congress intends to fund that at roughly $65 million for the first year in the next round of economic stimulus that Congress is considering. That may or may not happen. That appropriation could also come in the regular order appropriations process for the various federal agencies, which could also happen before the election. There's a lot up in the air, frankly, with regard to what's happening in Washington these days, and I'll get into a bit of that here in just a second. But anyway, the FCC needs roughly $65 million to begin full implementation of the DODC. So we think it's still going to be somewhere between 18 to 24 months before a new national broadband map is stood up on that, again, location-by-location accurate basis. There will be a robust challenge process for states and tribal governments to participate in. And so we see a need for states to begin preparing to participate in that challenge process, because the new national broadband map that results and the underlying data collection that happens to make it a reality will be informing decision-making at the federal level for the foreseeable future with regard to the expenditure of federal universal service fund dollars, with regard to other programs like USDA's Reconnect grant program. So it's very important that the new national broadband map that is created is done well, is done right, and that states have the opportunity to really challenge that in areas where the map is just simply incorrect. So we're going to see states move away from doing state broadband maps like the one that we produce for the state, and move toward this reacting to this new federal broadband map, the new FCC broadband map. So we look forward to having future discussions with you about what that looks like. Again, for the next 18 to 24 months or so, that map is not going to be ready, and Congress needs to appropriate funding first before it really becomes a reality. But it is something that we need to be thinking about. With regard to the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, I'm sure most of you on this call are aware that the FCC will be rolling out $16 billion of the $20.4 billion RDOF program starting next month as that reverse auction process proceeds. And those decisions, though, on where RDOF funding is directed will be based on old Form 477 data rather than this new digital opportunity data collection. And it is focused on areas where the Form 477 data say that the area is the census block is completely unserved, and so we know that there will be some errors with regard to the direction of that funding as a result of using Form 477 data. But still a massive amount of funding to get out the door. In addition to that, many states across the country are using CARES Act discretionary funding for broadband, despite early guidance from the U.S. Treasury Department that CARES Act dollars should be focused on needs that are occurring during the pandemic health emergency. Several states have rolled out $50 million plus state broadband grant programs using CARES Act dollars, including Missouri, Iowa, and Kansas. And then everyone, of course, is paying a lot of attention to what's going to happen with the next round of economic stimulus. Some people are calling it the fourth round. Some people are calling it the fifth round. There have been a number of bills that Congress has passed. Some are very small, some are very large, like the CARES Act. But all eyes are on Washington as they return, as Congress returns today, post-August recess, to see if a deal can be made between the House and Senate on additional funding for broadband. All indications are that the House and the Senate are still very far apart on what that deal looks like. The Senate has said that it may move forward with a skinny version of economic stimulus this week. Democrats are saying that that they're not going to agree to that. So we'll see what plays out. Right before the August recess began in late July, there were a lot of indications that a broadband, a huge broadband grant program could be created by Congress, or that it could be block granted to states to use. Senators Graham and Warner put forward a bill that would provide $10 billion in the form of block grants to states to spend on broadband. And that there were rumors that was on the table as a potential deal-making point that Republicans had offered Democrats. So we're going to see what happens. There's a lot of pressure to not only get a fourth round of economic stimulus passed between now and the election, but also to advance the regular order appropriations bills for the various federal agencies, or to at least do a continuing resolution through the end of the year to get us to the next Congress so that federal funding doesn't run out and that there isn't a federal government shutdown before the election. There's a lot going on in Washington right now, and we're tracking that very closely, and I'm happy to answer any questions on all that. So, Ashley, I think we're going to move now into the demo, and I'll turn the microphone back over to you.
Thank you, Brent. So I've now brought up the Minnesota Interactive Broadband Map, and what we would really like to show here are several of the data layers that we have available, several of the analysis pieces that have been put together so that the interactive map is as comprehensive as possible, giving as much detail to public consumers, state agencies, anyone needing this type of information to make decisions off of that regard broadband service. So the initial map that I've pulled up here is just looking at the four major fixed terrestrial types of broadband technology: fiber, cable, DSL, and fixed wireless. And all of these are showing where there's a minimum speed of at least 10 by 1. So we do have a legend, it's a dynamic legend down at the bottom of the screen here that will actually update as you turn on and off various different layers. So I'm going to turn off the initial layers here. As we mentioned, we also do quite a bit for the border-to-border grant program. So we have added different layers about areas that have been built out from the border-to-border grant funds. We've also activated different pop-ups that you can click on to see additional information about the provider, the project name, what year was it, and then there's also a hyperlink to get some additional information about that grant as well. We're also currently tracking areas that are to be built, so areas that are in progress from the various funding activities, and those will continue to be updated as the projects are complete, and bringing those data layers in as well. One of the tools that we've added to the map is a search. So you can enter in a full address, a partial address, and the map will then query the underlying broadband data to figure out who is offering service at a particular location. And it'll return a list of all of the different providers. They're just in alphabetical order. So you can see who's offering service at a specific location. You can also zoom into the map and grab this click tool, and you can click anywhere on the map. So you don't have to have an exact address, but you can do a search and click directly on the map to get the list of providers that are available at a specific location. And then again, a hyperlink to that provider's website to get additional information about service. One of the most unique analysis layers that's put together looks at unserved areas. So when we bring together all of the data where 25 by 3 service is available at a minimum, now we want to turn that into the inverse. What do the areas look like that don't have any broadband service at all? And so being able to add that level of detail, and this is looking at details by census block. So the boundaries that you see on the map are census block boundaries, and the darker the color, the higher the number of unserved households there are. And being able to provide that info gives more detail on where providers can find clusters of households that are unserved. And I believe, Brent, there was another point you wanted to make about this data layer specifically.
Yeah, so I think this this particular layer, because it shows, as Ashley mentioned, clusters of areas where density is higher, right? These are essentially low-hanging fruit. These are areas where people are located, where households are located more closely to one another, and therefore should be ones where it's more economical to deploy broadband infrastructure. So as we talk about this layer with all of the different state government leaders in states where we produce these types of maps, this is one that tends to get a lot of interest because this is really an area where minimal investment will result in maximum impact. If you think about deploying infrastructure in the most cost-effective way, you can really knock out a lot of unserved areas by focusing on the darker shades that are indicated on this map. So that's the point that I wanted to make.
Okay. And as we continue looking, we do have several different analysis data layers. I won't go through every single one individually, but I do want to highlight several of these different data layers and being able to show different analyses on the maximum download speed that might be available in a specific area. Again, the darker the color here, the higher the speed that's available as a download. What's the maximum a resident would be able to subscribe to in this particular area, and then being able to show that detail in the legend so people know what is that level of service that does exist there. We have a similar item for the maximum upload speed that is available. We also want to look at, statewide, there's a goal of 100 meg by 20 meg service, and where are those areas that have that speed already? And so being able to look at that from a statewide perspective to really get an idea of where the geographic areas that are still unserved at this state speed goal, and being able to move forward there. That gives the state additional information on where are those areas that need the most focus. A couple other data layers real quick here. Density of providers. This is looking at speeds of at least 100 by 20 that we just mentioned. I'm gonna see. trying to update real quick. Actually, I'm gonna reload this real quick. And then since I just refreshed the map, you'll be able to see that this locate providers by address tool actually opens up when you initialize the map, and then you can close it and you can certainly bring it back through some of the other tools that we have available on here. You can also change the base map. So here we're looking at the street map that's available. You can switch it over to imagery. Once you've zoomed into a specific location, if you want to compare the imagery to various service, you can do that as well. On this second tab here at the top, we've got some various availability and adoption statistics. So if we want to look by county, what is the percent of households that have service at 100 by 20 speeds? The darker the color, the higher the percent of households that are served. So you can start to see which counties don't have that level of service that is of interest. We also have that by school district. So you can start to see, again, the darker the color, the higher number of households have that level of service within each of the school districts as well. So we've got several different breakdowns of those availability statistics. School districts, we've also got township and county level. And then we've recently added some broadband adoption data from the American Community Survey done by the Census. Another interesting component that we've added here is that once you really start to look at unserved areas, so I'll turn on that layer again where we're looking at unserved areas. Again, the darker the color, the higher number of unserved households there are. But we've also added data layers on anchor institutions. So if you want to see public school locations in comparison to unserved households, how does that impact that school or that school district's ability to do remote learning activities? How many students may or may not have service at home from an access perspective and being able to overlay that. You can also click on any of the schools and get additional information about the schools that are in the area. And we have the same thing available for libraries, medical and healthcare facilities, and some other federal data sets as well. Down here at the bottom, we've also added additional data sets. Again, this is very helpful to compare to the unserved data layer, because now you can see where there are FCC registered towers available. And so especially where you've got some of these unserved areas, these towers could be potential assets to use for the expansion of broadband service. And so if a provider is using the interactive map, they'll be able to click on a specific tower asset, see who owns that asset so that they know who to contact for additional information. And then we include the FCC registration number so that that can be looked up as well, and perhaps those people contacted for additional information. I do just want to mention a couple other tools here. We do have a lot more information down here at the bottom. Several links. People can provide feedback if they do not have broadband service or if they see a discrepancy in the map, because we do use that information, like we mentioned, to target field validation services, so we can confirm and refine and edit and revise the map as many times as necessary to keep making it more accurate. We have various data download information that people can get additional information for their own use. And then we also have a very cool tool on querying data. So for instance, if I'm a provider that would like to apply for border-to-border grant funds, I can use this tool to query some of the data that's on the map. So for instance, if I want to know more information about the census blocks that are unserved, I can use the Query Census Block tool, and I can draw an area on the map. I can click a specific area. I can click Apply, and then while that's running, it's actually going to query all of the census blocks within the area that the user drew on the map to get a return on what do those census blocks look like? How many households are in those blocks? Because they may have a high density, but perhaps not a significantly high number of households that are physically unserved by internet. And so as that data starts to show up, it does appear down in the window. So it looks like in the shape that I drew on the map, it selected 671 census blocks, and it will start to show me additional information about how many households are served, unserved, whether they are lacking 10 by 1 service or are they lacking 25 by 3 wireline specific service. And then I can also export this information. So if I want to get a spreadsheet of all of this data that it has queried, I can now get a spreadsheet available and then use that because there are so many either federal programs or other programs that require providers to identify specific census blocks that they would like to build out to. And so providers can get this information directly from the map to be able to export that. And then also if providers do have their own data that's already available, whether it's on this specific platform that we're showing today, or if they've even got some geographic files perhaps, they will be able to upload that type of data directly to the map. It doesn't save, it is just in their individual window that they'll be able to add their own data. So perhaps if they have confidential data they would like to add to the map and see how it compares to various overlays, they'll be able to do that as well. So no, that was a quick demo of the map. The map is completely publicly available. So I'll go back to the PowerPoint slide here.
So actually,
yes.
before you move on, I think there are some questions that folks want to ask about the map. So Steve Georgie. Okay.
Thanks, Teddy. I was really interested in the school district boundary map, and it was it had the various colors, and you said the darker color was more coverage.
Yes. So we did some various analyses looking at school districts. So this one, for instance, is looking at, 25 by 3 wireline only service and comparing that to the school district boundaries. So we can start to see how many school districts have that, and then we've got the other different speed tiers as well.
So if you lower the map so you can see the North Shore, the Lake Superior School District is in 2 harbors. And so we just did a survey and they have 120 students without a connection in the Lake Superior School District. So I'm curious because you're showing that district is pretty much covered.
Sure, and that could be a difference between access and adoption. If the survey is based on whether the students have an internet connection at home, whether it's an active connection, or if perhaps lack of a device or cost is that a barrier. So that's definitely feedback we would want. So while this map is showing percent access might be available, the survey might be geared more towards do they physically adopt a service that may already be available. But certainly if there are discrepancies, if there are more students that don't have the service because it physically doesn't exist, we would definitely want to get that feedback to look at targeting the area for field validation and making those refinements to where access is physically available.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you.
And actually, if I can interject here for just a second. So, Steve, another tool that's available for school districts to use is we are in the process of taking over the work of our partner organization, Education Superhighway, and specifically with regard to school connectivity. But they have also developed a program called Digital Bridge, specifically during the pandemic, that is focused on off-campus connectivity. And they have developed a mapping tool that will allow school districts to confidentially upload their student household addresses and see those addresses overlaid on a service availability map. Now, the difference is that the service availability information that they're using for their mapping tool is taken from FCC Form 477 data, so it's census block level data. It's not more granular data like we have in this application. However, it will allow school districts to see which households are serviceable versus which households literally do not have access to the infrastructure itself, at least based on Form 477 data. So it's still a bit up in the air as to where that digital bridge mapping platform is going to be transitioned as Education Superhighway sunsets. We're hoping that it's going to be transitioned to us, as with our other work that we're taking over for them on campus connectivity. But if you'd like to learn more about that, please let us know. We're actually going to be in the process of setting up a call with Angie and Diane to go over that tool here sometime in the next week. And so that can be a really helpful resource to school districts where they're wanting to see specifically which households do and do not line up with reported coverage.
Sounds very
There's also
interesting.
a question from Vernon. Yeah. There's also a question from Bernadine that through your validation process from customer feedback, are you finding patterns in the reliability, accuracy of service data submitted by providers here in Minnesota? Some of the providers reported data being generally more reliable and accurate than others. If so, would you attribute those patterns of differences across the reliability of provider supplied data here in Minnesota?
Sure, that's an excellent question. So there are, across the board, there are several items that we kind of look at just in terms of the type of data that providers are able to supply. If they do have good network information that they can share with us, we feel a lot more confident about the representation on the map of where services are available. And then if there are providers that might need additional assistance on how to represent those areas, that may be some of those areas where we actually get additional consumer or customer feedback on those areas perhaps being overstated, perhaps even understated, and they need to be corrected on the map. So overall, there's a lot of participation within the state of Minnesota. We're currently tracking 123 providers across the state of all sizes and all technology types. So there's definitely benefits and kind of pros and cons all across the board in terms of working with the providers to collect what data they have, because it does come in so many different formats. But luckily for Minnesota, the program has been around so long that there has been continuous increases in participation. People and providers are very familiar with the border-to-border grant program. One of the stipulations is that if a provider does not participate in the mapping part, they will not be eligible to apply for funds or even challenge other areas that might be applied for. So we do see that there is additional participation from that being a factor, and then people just wanting to be able to see where the services are and are not available. So I don't think we can really make blanket statements about the level of field validation and consumer feedback and how that applies to each individual provider. But I would say that where consumers are challenging or providing more feedback in certain areas, there can be correlations to the type of data or the type of information providers can supply that show where services are physically available.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
No, not at this time. Please continue.
Okay. Yeah, so I think we're essentially complete with the last big item that we wanted to present was the demo itself. So definitely make sure to check out the map. Let us know any feedback that you have as well. If there are areas that you feel are overstated, understated, that you feel it's not an accurate representation, we want that type of feedback because that helps make the map more accurate. So just connectednation.org/Minnesota/interactive map, and that'll take you directly to the interactive map. And so that really concludes the presentation today. Really wanted to focus on that demo aspect to be able to show what the map is capable of and how to put together some of the access components with adoption and be able to make some of those additional decisions. If anybody has any questions or thinks of anything later, Brent and I are both available to help respond to those questions. But if not, we can turn it back over to you guys.
questions from the task force at this time? Everybody's thinking. I do have one question for you. We talked about the Broadband Data Act and how about that's 18 to 24 months away, obviously, from being a reality. And then a lot of states may shift over to kind of try to meet those requirements. How far off do you think the state of Minnesota is from, from an accurate, is there a lot of work to be able to comply with some of the new requirements that are in the Broadband Data Act? Are we close? What's kind of your sense for that?
The biggest part of the Broadband Data Act is that it's going to be a shift in how providers physically report their service areas to the FCC. So right now they're reporting via the Form 477, which is census block based. And so there's some inherent overstatement in how that's handled, especially in rural areas because census blocks are so much larger in rural areas. So right now, if one household is served by a broadband provider, then that entire census block is essentially lit up and is notified as served. And so the Broadband Data Act, what that is going to be doing is that there will still be semi-annual filings due from providers. In fact, there was one actually just due last Tuesday where providers self-report which census blocks they serve. That will shift with the Broadband Data Act to having providers provide details on where is their actual service area, independent of census block boundaries. So that is one good thing about the state program and being able to map for so many years in a row is that the providers across Minnesota are in a much better state to be able to take what we have mapped for them and be able to submit that to the FCC. And so when the time comes, we can certainly work with providers to get their service area in the file format necessary to submit to the FCC. So they're definitely ahead of the game. Minnesota is definitely mentioned as a prime example of how broadband mapping can be done successfully and get not only the providers prepared, but also have that level of feedback and confirmation of where those services are. So Minnesota's providers are definitely in a better shape to be able to submit the new style of data once that does become active.
Okay. And another question I had, one of the things Steve brought up earlier and kind of maybe the discrepancy on those two counties we saw earlier was around the availability versus the affordability piece, right? And so, is there something we can build on going forward as far as how do you overlay affordability? Is there a way something we can get that going forward, right? Because obviously the availability is the number one issue. If it's not available. It's a no good conversation starter. It doesn't even go there. So, but as far as, is there a way to overlay affordability over time? A variety of different ways. Any thoughts on that?
There are a few different ways to look at that. There are a couple states that are looking at ways to incorporate costs into their mapping programs, looking at what is 25/3 cost in the city versus a rural area, and being able to know what does that gap look like. The biggest thing was during the federal program, the SBI program. They were looking to collect cost information from providers, and that ended up being stricken from the requirements, so that actually did not go through at a federal level. There have been various projects that have looked at scraping speeds and associated costs and pricing from provider websites. And then, of course, there are the issues of, not an issue, but rather a challenge of bundling. So if you have, 25/3, it's going to be X cost, but then if you bundle that with a TV or telephone service, how does that price change, and how do you incorporate that into knowing what does the internet component cost? So there are certainly some challenges there. There has been provider pushback, but then there are also a lot of providers that very clearly post that type of information on their website. So there are some projects that are beginning to look at incorporating costs into analysis. That's not something that we've been doing in Minnesota at this point, but there are some projects and some other types of analyses that have at least been started on what pricing might look like in a specific area. Brent, do you have any other pricing details from perhaps a federal perspective?
I don't really have a lot to add. The digital opportunity data collection and the Broadband Data Act does not directly address the affordability or pricing information question. So we're not going to have location-specific pricing information moving forward, at least unless Congress acts again or the FCC acts again to further evolve that program. It is one of the more sensitive topics when speaking with provider trade associations and individual providers. It's been more difficult to get accurate pricing information to be disclosed on the whole. There's just more sensitivity around that subject.
Any other questions for Brent and Ashley? Thanks. Hearing none, Brent and Ashley, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I think this was super informative. A lot of good information here, and then some thoughts about what's coming down the pipe as well. So we do really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, awesome. So let's shift to the last topic on our agenda, and that's the report out from the subgroups. So maybe just to switch it up today, we'll start from the digital inclusion side. Bernadine, I'm not sure if you're able to figure out if the mic's working or not.
Hi, is that working?
Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Nice.
Awesome.
Great. Hello, everybody. So our subcommittee met in between meetings, and we are refining the language on the 4 resolutions that we've shared with you in past meetings that we intend to bring forward for review by the full committee for our report. Thanks to Mark, shout out to Mark Johnson, who provided some good feedback to Dale on our committee, who reached out for some details. We're looking at refining the final language on the TAP, the library, and the school funding that historically this task force has recommended that the legislature fund those kind of sister programs to ensure libraries and schools are able to take full advantage of federal dollars. So those edits to our draft resolutions have been made with Mark's help. And we also met with, talked about Ann Tracy being the writer for our team, and we're excited about being able to use, we see one of the contributions our subgroup can make is to provide stories, first-person accounts, some texture, some detail about the impact of broadband on community economic vitality, and conversely, in the digital inclusion side, what it means to not be connected. So we hope that some of the color and stories that Anne has collected in her role on the blog will help us there. So really, other than that, it's kind of, we don't have any new recommendations that we're cooking up. You'll see from us the ones around the main one is that we want to fund the fund, of course, providing a program budget for the Office of Broadband Development for the first time. That hasn't been done in the past, so that they can engage and support adoption activities. And then our 2 recommendations about these library and school funds. So that's what I got, unless Dale or Micah, and Jason joined our group, so we're so glad about that. Sorry he's not here today. He felt bad that his first meeting after he joined, he was on vacation, but that was long planned. So that's what we got from our hearty band.
Good stuff, Bernadine. 2 things for you. One is obviously, and that you have Jason on your team, including some pieces from the tribal lands. I think that will be super important as well, and some of the stories you bring out in the recommendations. So it'll be interesting to see how that kind of rolls into it. Second thing, well, we have you on the, still without going on mute yet, maybe you want to give us a little bit of sort of, I don't know if there's any updates for the upcoming session in October. Anything we should know?
Yeah, thanks so much, Teddy. You bet. We've been working closely with Diane and Angie. So good to see them today on the call from the Office of Broadband Development as our co-partners in the conference. And they have identified 2 broadband recipients, or grant recipients from the Border Broadband Conference. You maybe recall that our goal as a group in October is to get to hear first person live and engage with some teams from communities who have benefited from this broadband grant program and what difference that's made, how it's impacted their communities. Angie and Diane have identified 2 communities that we're going to be working with, and we're in the process of getting that all organized. So that morning of October, we'll get to hear directly from them. And you know what? I'm kind of blanking. Melrose, it feels like, was one of them. Maybe Angie or Dan could help me. Don't remember. And Rock County, I think. Rock County and Melrose are the 2 projects.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you, Bernadine. Any questions for this, comments for this subgroup? Okay. Hearing none, maybe we'll move over to the Minnesota model.
Can you hear me, Teddy?
Yes, I can, Brian.
Our group really looked at still having the still primary core issues that we had from last month. I want to do a shout out to Steve for agreeing to volunteer on the writing team. I think the thing that our last discussion was that we have the model that other states are following. The part that we're struggling with is the funding. So that continues to be our number one issue, is funding for the Office of Broadband Development. It needs to be a top priority, and as we mentioned last month, there's no funding for 2021 based on the current status. We continue to support the border-to-border grant dollars spread across the entire state of Minnesota and to prioritize funding for areas that are unserved. We like the initial application process. We need to get the goal going to cover the entire state of Minnesota. I think there was some concerns that I know Teresa had expressed last month, is that, if we change from the 25-3 to a new model, well, we're just making it harder to catch up for the rest of the state to get to that 25-3. So we think we got the program. We just need funding is probably our biggest focus, and I'd like to ask Teresa or Steve or Paul if they have any additional comments. Hearing none, that's our report, Teddy.
Thank you very much. That was good, and I like the. Yeah, I think there was good conversation going back and forth on email on, we still have long ways. We still have to finish the 25-3, and then we got the 100, and I know there's discussion about, is it a mere 100 or 110 or whatever that might be specifically. And then, does it make it more cumbersome to add yet a third goal where we haven't even achieved the 25-3 yet? I think, we can mention, I think, what a new goal could be, but I don't know that we need to recommend that needs to be in there. But that would be a good discussion when you formalize some of the recommendations and what the rest of the task force thinks on that topic. So thank you for that update. Any questions or comments for this subgroup? Okay. Hearing none, we'll move over to the barriers of technology. So, Mark is still on, maybe?
Okay, yeah, yep. Thanks, Teddy.
Yep.
Sure, and I was, and again, thank you, as other groups have mentioned to their writers, thank you to Cassie for stepping forward to help us out, and we'll say that, Cassie, I got your email, and I'll be in touch with you for sure. As we move forward, we're excited about having someone to help us with that. I was glad also to hear Bernadine talk about the stories. I know our subgroup has talked a lot about telling those stories, again, from a technology and barrier standpoint. It's sort of the things we're supposed to be talking about. That's a little bit all-inclusive of everything in a way, because those stories tell us about where there are barriers. Those stories tell us about what is successful, what kinds of technologies have been successful. And so I was excited to hear Bernadine talk about telling some of those stories, and our group is certainly willing to help with that with that as well. Another story we also talked about was, and that ties into talking about the Minnesota model and some of the success that we've had in the state, is telling that cooperative story. So many of the successes in our state have been the result of cooperatives of in some form, whether it be a telephone cooperative that already existed or a new cooperative that was formed to be able to do some of the projects in the border-to-border program that have had great success, and some outside of the border-to-border program that have had great success. So we wanted to make sure that we're able to tell that story as well as we move along. And then hearing about the speed goal from our Minnesota Model Group, that is one that we've grappled with tremendously in our subgroup as well. Not sure we have complete agreement yet in our subgroup on it even, as we probably don't across the entire task force, but that's something that we'll, I'm sure, bring forward to the large group and have a good discussion about. We are worried about that aspect of having another goal, and what does that do to the people who still aren't served, under the previous goal. So certainly one of our recommendations, so to speak, or something we want infused into this discussion, is that we have to have a focus on serving those who are not connected first, so that we are not saying we have a 120 goal in 2026 and we have some futuristic goal that we're looking at moving beyond, that we forget about those folks. We don't want to forget about those folks who still haven't met the initial goal. So we want to find a way to make sure that we've infused that. It was good to hear today from the satellite industry. That was kind of the last technology we wanted the entire group to hear from. That's been one of the roles of our subgroup, is to make sure that we're identifying those technologies and getting those in front of us. We still understand there's an affordability barrier that's come up quite a bit today, and that's something we continue to work to look at, as well as the mapping. We heard about that a little bit today too. So we also can, of course, support the full funding of the Office of Broadband Development and the Border-to-Border Grant Project as we move forward as well. So we've talked about all of those things. I think we're focusing on that speed goal issue to try and see if there's a recommendation we can come out of to bring to this full group. And I know it sounds like I need to work with the Minnesota Model Group on that as well, and we will do that moving forward. So that's what I've got. I don't know if Dave, Steve, Jim, Nolan, any of you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, thank you, Mark.
All right, that sounds like our report, Mr. Chair.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, and it looks like some good work is happening there as well. So as you get together with the writers, that'll be exciting. Any questions for this subgroup before we move on? And Bernadine, I know you have a comment here. It says, I hope the full task force can have a discussion of our speed goal recommendation. Recognize that economic development is on the upload speed. We need to look at what we expect from Minnesota. Yes, we will have. I think the best thing is to kind of get a recommendation and some narrative on paper that we can all review, and then we will have a full discussion on this topic. Because I think this is where we need to get alignment from the entire task force. So look forward to that here soon. Okay, so I think we've covered all the agenda items for today. Before we move on to any public comments or any other open business, is there any questions or comments about the topics for today? Okay, Steve, I think you have a question for us. see Georgia was looking in there, but
Well, if I could, Teddy, at the last
Go ahead.
at the last meeting, I believe it was Brian that brought up a lot of broadband concerns during the pandemic, and the task force has really not been involved or used as a sounding board or a resource. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think that was important. And the other question was, as we heard today, other states have allocated significant dollars out of their CARES Act funds for broadband projects, and Minnesota chose not to. Was there any conversation with the governor or his staff on that? I know Mississippi just sent something out, $65 million in broadband projects. 15 different electrical utilities picked up on that opportunity and are going to be doing significant fiber installations by the end of the year. I'm just curious if you had an opportunity to have that conversation with the governor or staff.
So let's kind of separate. So to answer your first one, as far as our engagement or using the task force in a more proactive way from last time, there's been some conversation around that. I still need to follow up with the Commissioner of Deeds, Steve Groves, to see which ways we can get more involved, but that has been communicated to them. But the other thing is we also want to get the governor on one of our calls. Here, it's either an October or November one. We can. I don't know that we'll have a lot of time for questions, but that in itself will set it up of like, well, what's the best use of this task force, and what are maybe some of the recommendations that I'd like to see come from us, so that would be impactful to the legislature. So I think even if we don't have a chance to ask questions on the call, what we'll do is we'll probably submit the questions ahead of time for some of the remarks he can make on this, and that in itself will be a way of sending a question. So we are working on getting that set up in itself. So that should, hopefully kind of get a little more traction there. On the CARES Act piece, now this is where it's still a little bit up in the air how you're supposed to use CARES Act dollars, right? States are using it very loosely. I would say from our standpoint, our state is sort of following the guidelines that were given, which was that if you had the CARES dollars and needed to use them, it had to be used before the end of the year and implemented before the end of the year, which then puts a lot of pressure on a lot of the work that gets done on the infrastructure side for building out broadband would not get done before the end of the year, and so therefore can't be used for this. And so this is the loop we're in, and some of the states are just ignoring that and moving forward. The stand from our state, at least from what I understand, is we're going to go by what we've been told. So that's a little bit of discrepancy. That said, now some of the counties, once they get the CARE dollars, CARES Act, they could use it in more interesting ways for things that even if they follow, they could say, well, we could set up hotspots and things that are more temporary and could get done before the end of the year. So a lot of that flexibility sort of is left at that point in time. But again, I'm happy to follow up with the commissioner on this piece as well. But that's my understanding at this point in time. I don't know if there's comments from others. And Bernadine, you said Otter Tail County has allocated $200,000 for CARES Act to broadband projects. Angie, I know you and I have talked about it. I don't know if there's any comments from your end.
If I may, Teddy, too, I know that I think there's about 4 other counties that have reached out to CTC, but I find there's a bit of irony because we heard last month from the Department of Ed, who said it's the responsibility of independent school districts to not only provide a device, but a connection for their students for distance learning. And they gave them 2 pots of money, Governor's Emergency Fund and the ESSER. And, so on one hand, it sounds like the Department of Ed is saying it's okay to use these CARES Act dollars, but overall, from a state perspective, we shouldn't. And with such a short construction season, every day that passes, that opportunity is slipping by. But all I have to say.
Oh, you're absolutely right about that. You're absolutely right about that.
Betty, I think from the township perspective, we're encouraging towns to try and do something if they can do it by the end of the year with their CARES dollars, or if they have another local government, they have extra money and another local government is doing something, they can transfer it. But it was pursued. I think there's just some confusion about whether you can do anything past the end of the year. I don't feel there's confusion. I think you have to do it by the end of the year, but there's some discussion about, well, other states are doing other things. I'm curious about what they're doing. Are they implementing everything by the end of the year? Because we're all supposed to be under the same federal rules on this.
Yep. We'll see if we can, I think somebody on the chat said, this would be a good topic for a discussion. I know, well, maybe we'll, to Steve's point, time's passing by, right? So if we postpone it for another month and there's only 2 months left and then 2 more months and there's only 1 month left, and then it becomes a moot point after that, right? So we'll see maybe if we can, if I can get some more insight on this, on who can actually give us better insights, and maybe we'll set up a special session just to have this conversation.
I was going to say, Teddy, on the Iowa program, they more or less said that the project had to start and begin construction in 2020, and then it had to be completed in 2021. So I think you're right that every state has seemed to interpret the law and the rule a little different way, and that's unfortunate because it's kind of a hodgepodge of what we have to deal with. But I also wanted to just say thanks, Teddy, for reaching out to Governor Waltz on that, because I just think that with the people that are on this committee, that he needs to utilize this team as a resource to help him, and especially with Angie and Diane to get more engaged in what our mission is to get broadband across Minnesota. So thanks for reaching out, and thanks for bringing it up, Steve.
Good conversation on that one. So takeaway, obviously, we'll see if we can get Governor on the phone with some questions, and then we'll see if we can maybe set up some session on a little more clarification on this CARES Act piece. At a minimum, what we could do is potentially have one of the subgroups, or somebody at least attend one of the subgroup meetings and give a detailed update there, and make it open to others to attend if you want to. Okay. Other business topics we should be aware of, others beyond the task force members, anything you want to state at this point in time? And any other questions, comments from anyone about anything? All right. Sounds like we've exhausted the topics for the day. Well, I appreciate everybody's engagement. Hopefully the topics, we covered a lot of the topics, actually. When we started out the session back in earlier this year and listed out the things we wanted to review and hear from folks, I've actually exhausted the list of things that we had talked about hearing. Now, obviously, there's places we wanted to visit, providers we wanted to see, towns we wanted to visit. Obviously, none of that was possible because of the virus. But as far as topics, I think we covered most of those things. There may be one or two topics left on funding and policy. We'll try to see how we can bring that in. We also have one more topic left on, you heard a little bit about that Broadband Data Act today from the federal side. We have reached out to the FCC. We're hoping to have them today, but they postponed one more time as they don't have quite the details of how the new mapping requirements are going to be executed. But we will try to have them on either on the October or November meeting. Obviously, the October meeting is packed agenda as we are working with Bernadine and the Blandon Foundation on the event that day. We will have a task force meeting for 1 hour to 90 minutes, I think, with open topics. And we will kind of see what topics we will fill into that time. Other than that, I'm excited that, the teams are coming together. Recommendations are, getting a little bit crisper. The writers, I think, will help bring some structure to what we want to propose. So the big things items going for us now is getting obviously the recommendations and reports ready, and then having discussions on the topics that we need to have as a group related to those recommendations. So things like what should our goals be? Is there additional discussions on funding and things of that nature? So, but other than that, I think we're in good shape. I think things will get a little bit busier here in October and November as we work on the report. And, we have the scheduled meetings, but depending on how things go, we may have a couple other sessions included in that, specifically even to the topic we just talked about around the CARES Act right now. With that, I want to thank everybody for their engagement, for your participation, and continuing, to participate and advocate for this cause. I think pandemic showed us a lot, and recommendations should carry some weight, and we want to make sure that we want to be used in the most effective way. With that, I will close off the meeting, and we will talk